Thank you, Kyla, for that worship, leading us in worship, and for that really quite lengthy reading this morning. So as I was listening, I was thinking there is a lot there that we are not going to get to today. So just you'll notice I'm not dressed as Pilate today. So maybe a bit grateful for that. But anyway, today we are looking at Pilate. We have been in the series of encounters with Jesus, and what we've really tried to do in this series is look at the characters and how they were changed or transformed by their meeting and their interactions with Jesus. And so today we're going to look at Pilate and how he met with Jesus. So as we just heard, he was the Roman governor who presided over the trial that led to Jesus' crucifixion. And in this very dramatic scene, we have these two very different dialogues going on. So we have Pilate dialoguing with the Jews and the crowd, and we have him dialoguing with Jesus inside. And then we also have these three different worlds colliding. So we've got the first world as the Roman Empire, and Pilate represents that world. And then we've got the Jewish kingdom with the Pharisees and the leaders representing that. And then we've got a third kingdom, which is Jesus' kingdom, which he says is not from this world. And these three very differing worlds collide in this section. And Pilate is the hinge and the intersection of all those worlds. And so the question that you might like to ask yourself as we go through today is, which of those kingdoms do I most relate to? Which of those kingdoms would I like to perhaps most relate to? So which is the one that I walk in the most in my world? And is that the one that I really want to be walking in my world? So let's step back a little bit. I have to say I have no stories today. No stories. I was thinking Parrot's truth stories. No, they would need to be censored too much. So there are no stories from our lives today. So I thought I could think of stories, but I'm going to get you to do the work. And so I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to get into some groups and discuss some of these things first. So first of all, what makes up a kingdom? What are the things that make a kingdom tick? The mechanics, the whatever. So turn around in your groups. There are quite a few of these questions. On Friday, I seriously thought this might be the entire sermon. We're just going to have discussion groups. But we have got some. So just turn around and interact. What are the things that make a kingdom? What things are necessary? You've only got 1 minute, so get talking. All right, next question. So you've got your kingdom. What things make up a kingdom? I could ask for feedback. What were some of the things that you decided, that you thought? Sorry? A king or a leader? Did I hear over here? Yep. What else? Land, territory, yep. Yeah, yeah. Leaders, plural. Yeah. Laws, governance, exactly. Yep. Anything else? Huh? Okay. Explain. Right. Okay. All good. All right, next question. Sorry, Ken. Yeah. Yeah, all of those things. Okay, so next question is, in what ways do our modern political systems function as kingdoms, and in what ways are they different? Okay, think about that. What ways are they similar? What ways are they dissimilar? Okay, what was the consensus? How are they similar? How are they dissimilar? Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, just got lost there. Ken? That's a very good question. Yes.
I guess in New Zealand we have a democracy, so we technically have a king.
Yeah. Yeah. So in some.
Power is kind of spread a bit more.
Yes. Yes. So it's not an autocracy. All right. So another question. What happens if we replace the word kingdom? This might take the whole sermon, I'll just leave the rest. If we replace the word kingdom with power, does that translate more? Does that make it easier to think about modern life? Yeah? Oh, we could just have a whole group discussion. Okay, next question. How does that power then influence action? And where have you seen this play out, either recently or historically? How does that power translate top down to influence actions? This is a very large question, actually. Maybe think of one concrete example. Ukraine? Yeah? Yes, Mac. Right. Mm. 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 Yeah. Yeah. So, and leads to the final question, which how does authoritarian power control actions, And what do they promise, authoritarian regimes, and what do they actually deliver? Excellent, thank you, Craig. Tariffs, yeah, I mean, and we can probably play that out. They promise security through economics, but yeah. And what then gets lost in that process? Yep. Ken. Authoritarian? Well, it's a really good question, and it's one that maybe we'll explore a little more through our sermon, because an authoritarian regime really narrows down, like Mac was saying, how you actually think and your actions that go from that. So let's bring this in then. Okay, maybe I will have to say the rest of my sermon. Because one of the first things that gets lost in an authoritarian regime is freedom and truth are two of the main things that get lost very quickly. And so let's have a little look at the Roman Empire, which was in our reading today, which dominated much of the ancient world at the time that we're talking about. So Rome promised peace, the Pax Romana, around the world that they were in control of. They promised justice, they brought roads, military protection, economic prosperity. But it came with this military might. And dominance. So there were swords and there were wars and there was punishment for insurrection. If you didn't do what they said, well, there were consequences. And so they brought lots of good things with them, roads, aqueducts, etc., relative peace, people could travel relatively safely, but freedom was very much limited. The empire ruled, the empire decreed what was acceptable, what was law, and if that was different to your culture or your language or your religion, well, that was just too bad, really. And you got to pay for the privilege of having the Romans in your country through your taxes, which could be very crippling, actually, as a dominated nation. And so Pilate was a local ruler in Judea, and he would normally have been based in Caesarea on the coast, which was a much nicer place, but he would come to Jerusalem for the Passover because it was dodgy and there might be a riot and insurrection, so he needed to be there because there was potential for uprisings at those times. Now, we don't know a lot about Pilate from history. This actually isn't a bust of Pilate. It's a contemporary Roman man from around 30 AD. So generic thing that was there. But anyway, gives you the idea. But there is an inscription on a stone that was found, and there are descriptions of him in contemporary literature. The Jews didn't really like him very much. He'd done some really dumb things in Jerusalem and in Israel that outraged them over the years. He was eventually sent back to Rome after the crucifixion. He was sent back to Rome to answer to Tiberius for some settling down some insurrection with the Samaritans, and there was a massacre, and so he went back to Rome, but Tiberius died before he got there, and so we don't really know what happened to him after that. He sort of disappears from the record. So there are lots of made-up stories about what happened to him, that he committed suicide, that his grave is somewhere in France, and there's various stories, but we don't really know. So Philo talked about him as inflexible, stubborn, and cruel, and noted that Pilate feared an appeal to Rome because it might expose his corruption and his acts of insolence and his rapine and his habit of insulting people and his cruelty and his continual murders of people untried and uncondemned and his never-ending and gratuitous and most grievous inhumanity. So, doesn't sound particularly nice person after all that. But despite all of that, he is named in the Nicene and the Apostles' Creeds, attesting to the historicity of the crucifixion of Jesus. And John pays more attention to the Roman trial than in any of the other Gospels, the writers. And we don't know how he got this information. Perhaps he snuck into the praetorium, like he snuck into the priest's house for Jesus' trial of the priests. But he gives us this detailed dialogue between Pilate and Jesus. And it's that dialogue in chapter 18 and 19 that shows us this progression in Pilate, or perhaps regression, you might want to say, from curious and confident and domineering and in control to becoming this more and more trapped person. He is actually unable to operate as he wanted. He is unable to actually do the thing he wants to do to release Jesus. He is a victim of the power that he claims to represent. And so if we were to put these verses in a chart, it might look something like this. Don't know if you can read it. I hope you can. Yeah, so we see this drama pivoting around Pilate. And in the very centre of these verses is the scourging. And that is the bit that Pilate thinks will change things. That if he whips Jesus and beats him, that will satisfy the Jewish leaders and they will let him go and he won't need to condemn him to death. There is that hope there in that, but actually that is the point of no return. So Pilate goes in and out between Jesus and the Jews of this praetorium and the outside courtyard. And he's maintaining these very different conversations. And if you were to imagine this in sound, you'd hear the contrast between the noise of the crowd outside as he goes out and everybody yelling and shouting and carrying on, and then the contrast between the very calm conversation with Jesus and the challenging, intense time he has with Jesus. So he starts off as very curious. What is the charge? Verse 29. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" He presumably knew that this was coming because Roman soldiers were involved in the arrest of Jesus. So he knew something was up. So now he wants to know what exactly was the reason. He wants to bring justice to the situation. So we're coming back to our conversation about power, because here we see the Jewish kingdom is at play. The Jewish kingdom is wrestling with empire. The irony here, of course, is that the Jewish kingdom was supposed to be ruled by God. The Pharisees, in keeping the law, was supposed to be all about obeying God's law and being an example of justice and righteousness to the surrounding nations. They were anticipating the return of a king in the line of David, but they missed it. And a really crude example of this would be like something like Star Wars, which, sorry, Che, you haven't seen it yet. Sorry, calling her out. But Star Wars, which I'm assuming most of you are familiar with, if the empire rules everything and the rebels are trying to, throw off the shackles of the empire, right? It would be as if Luke Skywalker came along and instead of embracing him and thinking, you're going to be our hero, they killed him. That is the equivalent of what the Jewish kingdom are doing here. And it makes no sense. But for the Jewish leaders to acknowledge Jesus as king meant giving up their power that they had established. And it's quite okay to say you're doing all this stuff for God as long as God doesn't actually show up. And sometimes I think we can be a bit like that too. We want to do this stuff, we think we're doing good stuff, but we're not actually expecting God to show up. We can all have a tendency to do that. So the Jewish leaders at this point give a non-answer. They knew their charge was not enough for the death penalty in Roman law. Jewish religious concerns were never going to get someone executed. And Pilate suspects this. So in verse 31-32, Pilate says, "Take him yourselves, judge him by your own law." And they say, "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. And this took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. The Jews could kill someone by stoning. We see that in Stephen and various other examples. But John has said that Jesus will be lifted up. Jesus has said he will be lifted up. And that is how he was going to die. So then we step into this quiet space with Pilate and Jesus in verse 33. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate is presumably curious and also a bit skeptical. Are you the king of the Jews? He is expecting some major rebel leader, like a military leader, someone who's going to actually cause chaos, cause a riot, firing up the pot, causing ructions and civil disobedience. And Jesus is totally none of that. He is a complete contrast to Pilate's expectations. And so Jesus questions back to Pilate, "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" This is what Jesus does every time. He goes right to the person and takes the person where they are at and starts there. We see that with the blind man, the lame man, the Samaritan woman. He starts with the person where they are at. And Pilate he wants to know if Pilate is genuinely curious about who Jesus is, or is he just repeating what others have told him? Does he actually want to know who Jesus is? And it seems from Pilate's answer in verse 35, "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied, "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" It seems that Pilate really just wants to get the matter resolved. He wants to know, what's Jesus done? What's the problem here? Does it warrant death? Let's get the business done. And if we think about what Jesus had done in his ministry, healing people, feeding people, bringing hope, restoration to hundreds of people, then his answer in verse 36 makes sense. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." His kingdom is not of this world. Jesus' kingdom is a third kingdom, and it is a totally different kind of power. It's not based on fear. It's not based on autocracy. There is no having to grasp or take hold of power. In fact, the very opposite is being played out. Jesus is in the process of laying down his life because he sees what life is really for, what his life is for. It is for a sacrifice. And he is not concerned with holding on to something out of fear or to please any higher up. In fact, God is laying himself open at this moment through Jesus, being vulnerable to the very worst of humanity: self-interest, greed, corruption, clinging to power. So in verse 37, Pilate responds, "You are a king then?" And Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. In fact, the very reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." So he's still confusing Pilate here. He acknowledges Pilate saying he's a king. It's like, well, if you say so. And John really wants that to be clear. And we see that in what Pilate eventually nails to the cross, that this was the King of the Jews. That is the message that John wants us to get. But Jesus' purpose here is to testify to the truth. This is why he was born and came into the world. In John 8, if we read John 8, this is what Jesus says about himself. And it's, when we think about, like when we take this from John 8, truth is a really defining characteristic of God's kingdom. And it's a defining characteristic of Jesus. He told truth to the people. He is truth. He is the way, the life, and the truth. And truth gets completely lost. It's one of the first things to go in authoritarian regimes, because the truth gets muddied. It gets manipulated to tell the story of whoever's in charge. And so we see propaganda machines and lies come, we see in our media and etc., that changes depending on who's in charge and what story wants to be told. But Jesus is saying that he defines truth, that he is the truth. And so Pilate's very famous response, "What is truth?" seems to end the conversation. And there's a picture of, there are many renditions of this moment in art. What is truth? He then goes out again to with this he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him." He's not interested in finding out more about this truth from Jesus or more of who Jesus is. But he has decided that Jesus is harmless and he should be released. And this is where we see Pilate start to lose control. See, we see the results of these three operating systems collide in the cross. Pilate, in particular, shows us what really happens in authoritarian regimes. Even though he thinks Jesus is innocent and wants to release him, which is what we see in chapter 19, he's completely controlled by the political forces that he thinks are powerful and working for him. But he's controlled by them, and he ends up completely powerless. His plan to release Jesus completely backfires, and every further attempt he makes to appease the crowd, appease the rulers, the flogging, the mockery, making an example of him. When we see in verse 5, he says, "Behold the man." He brings Jesus out, a wreck, an absolute wreck after the flogging. I think this painting looks a bit sanitized to me. But this is like a sarcastic attempt. Here is the man, totally wrecked, belittling Jesus. All the power that Pilate thinks he can hold on to is doing him absolutely no good at all. Because so at verse 8, he becomes genuinely worried. It's so ironic that in verse 7 of chapter 19, the Jewish leaders insisted, we have a law, and according to that law he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. The leaders say he has to die because of this, and that should really have bothered them to hear themselves say that. It's like, have you listened to yourself? Have you listened to what you're actually saying? That he's the Son of God? And it doesn't bother them at all. But it really gets to Pilate. Because in Roman mythology, gods became human all the time and did things to test humans. And so Pilate's thinking, oh my word, this person actually could be a god. What do I do? And he is really, genuinely spooked. I mean, I could reference the Odyssey here, but I haven't seen it, and it's Greek anyway, so wrong culture. But Pilate is really spooked by this moment. Verse 8, when Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. He went back inside the palace. Where do you come from? He asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. Do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said. Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? And so it makes sense that he is really worried by this when we understand this. And now he really wants to know where Jesus comes from, and he really wants to let him go, but Jesus won't talk to him. And the trap is now set. And for all the power that Pilate thinks he has, he does not have the strength and he doesn't have the courage to fight both the empire and the weight of the Jewish religious system. And so even though he's convinced of Jesus' innocence, he is powerless to release him. And we see the rest of chapter 19 play out as it's like a kings of the earth shouting match almost, because the Jewish leaders play on the loyalty that is needed in an autocratic system, that Pilate must function as a lackey of Caesar. And so even though they hate Caesar, they shout, "We have no king but Caesar," when it works for them. They would rather have the corrupt system that they know and that they can manipulate than a system that would upend everything they know and leaves them dependent on God. And it's not hard to see some parallels of this in our society today. No one really loves a dictator. Well, maybe their families. You would hope that they love them. But people love what the dictator can do for them. They think that they will use the dictator or the power of the dictator to get their own agenda passed, to further or feather their own nest, or to do whatever is most advantageous for themselves or for their own gain and self-interest. And that is where the truth gets completely lost. Because who is going to tell the truth if it doesn't work to your advantage? And we've seen this breakdown in our media in recent years. And it's the same in history. Propaganda machines are one of the first things to go in a regime that is rising, an autocratic regime that is rising. So it happened in Roman times, Tiberius, but Stalin, Hitler, Trump, Putin, Xi Jinping, whoever you want to name, there is a process where truth gets lost, propaganda comes, and truth is just gone. And this is where the Roman Empire and Jewish religious systems were the same. They both worked to crush the man who brought a completely different kingdom with him, a kingdom that spoke truth. Ultimately, both those systems were working out of fear and out of control, and the freedom was extremely limited. But the third kingdom that Jesus brings is based on truth. It is and brings the freedom to act out of love, not fear. The freedom to sacrifice ourselves as Jesus did for goodness, for justice, for the interests of others. Because we know that Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. It works with a completely different operating system. Jesus' kingdom speaks to truth. The truth will set you free, Jesus says in John 8. Our understanding of sin and our insight into ourselves as sinners sets us free to worship and to accept Christ. It works on truth and works to make us fully human by surrendering ourselves to Jesus, fully surrendering our own agenda to him. We ironically become free to live as Jesus did, to live a life of love that pours itself out for others. And this is what we see on the cross. I asked you a question at the beginning. Which kingdom do you align with? We all have a choice. Maybe we make it consciously, maybe we make it unconsciously. We just choose by our actions and how we choose to live. Ironically, those two kingdoms that fought that morning on that Friday morning 2,000 years ago are both gone. The Jewish temple was destroyed in 70 AD. The Roman Empire has long ceased to exist. But the kingdom that Jesus brought in with him is still here and growing. If I were to leave you with a big idea this morning, it would be this: that ultimately Jesus' kingdom, which brings truth and freedom, is the only one worth living and dying for. And so as we think about what Jesus went through in this trial, we realize that he went willingly and knowingly to the cross for each one of us. And this is what we remember when we take communion. We remember his sacrifice. We remember that when we take this bread and wine, we are aligning ourselves once again with Jesus and with his kingdom. We do this, we repeat it each week until he comes, because until his kingdom is fully realized in us and in this world again. Let's pray. Dear Lord, I thank you that you went willingly to the cross for each one of us. I thank you that your kingdom represents truth and freedom to be fully human, fully known, and fully loved by you. Lord, I pray that we will desire to be a part of your kingdom that is so different to what rules in this world. Lord, I pray you give us the strength and the humility to follow your example of love that you have set for us. In your holy name we pray. Amen.